He had always thought himself clever, too clever, in fact, for anyone to catch him. Years of practice had honed his skills into an art form. A flicker of charm here, a calculated lie there, and the world seemed to part for him like a stage curtain. He studied people, learned their weaknesses, and twisted them into threads he could pull until they unraveled. It was never about brute force. It was about patience, precision, and making people believe they wanted to hand over whatever he desired. He called it persuasion. The rest of the world called it fraud. This time, his eyes had landed on a woman named Evelyn Carr. She didn't stand out in a crowd, quiet, plain, the kind of person people often overlooked. Perfect. The unremarkable were always the easiest. They longed to be noticed, to be valued, and he knew exactly how to give them that, just long enough to take it away. He watched her for weeks, learned her routines. She worked at an old bookstore, drove a modest car, lived in a small but tidy apartment. She carried herself with the air of someone who had learned to live without expecting much. The plan was simple. He'd bump into her at the cafe she frequented, spark a conversation over their shared preference for black coffee, and let her believe it was a chance encounter. He would drop hints of a lucrative opportunity, something exclusive and low risk, and when her curiosity bit, he'd reel her in. The money might not be life-changing for him, but it would be enough to make the effort worthwhile. The meeting went perfectly, at first. She smiled politely, listened intently, even laughed at his carefully placed jokes. Over the next week, they met for coffee twice more, then lunch, then dinner. He began to weave the story of his fabricated investment deal, speaking just vaguely enough to intrigue but not so vaguely as to arouse suspicion. She seemed interested. Encouraged, he moved to the next step, the pitch. It happened one rainy evening, over candlelight in a small Italian restaurant. He laid it all out. The chance to double her money in a matter of weeks, the inside connections, the limited window of opportunity. He even leaned in, lowered his voice, and offered to let her in with a much smaller amount than he was giving others, just because he liked her. He expected hesitation, maybe a polite request for time to think. What he didn't expect was the way her eyes seemed to sharpen in the dim light. "That's interesting," she said, her tone smooth, almost amused. "I've heard of deals like this before. In fact, I've spent quite a bit of time studying them." He smiled, playing along. "Then you know how rare an opportunity like this is." "Oh, I know exactly how rare it is," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "I also know they're never real. You see, I used to work in financial crime investigation. Now I freelance, mostly private cases for people who've been defrauded. My current client has been looking for a man who matches your description almost perfectly." Funny, isn't it? For the first time in years, his mouth went dry. He tried to laugh it off, to shift the conversation, but she was already pulling something from her bag, a small voice recorder. She pressed play, and his own voice filled the space between them, recounting the details of the same investment pitch he'd just given her. Every word was crisp, undeniable. "I've been recording all our conversations," she said, her voice calm, almost kind. "You've been sloppy lately. Maybe you thought no one was watching, but you chose the wrong target this time." She stood, setting a folded piece of paper on the table. "These are the contact details of the detective handling my client's case. I suggest you get in touch before he gets in touch with you. And if you try to disappear," her smile was polite but cold, "you know better than to underestimate someone who's already found you once." Then she was gone, leaving him staring at the empty chair, the untouched dessert, and the sinking realization that for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. That night, he didn't sleep. He thought about all the people he'd conned, all the times he'd walked away smug and untouchable. And now, one mistake, a single wrong choice of target, had turned the hunter into the hunted. He knew there was no running from her. And somewhere, in the dark quiet of his apartment, he finally understood what it felt like to be the perfect mark. He told himself, at first, that maybe she was bluffing. Maybe Evelyn was just some sharp-tongued woman with a knack for theatrics, trying to scare him off. After all, plenty of people talked big when they felt cornered. But the moment he picked up that folded paper she'd left behind, his stomach turned. It wasn't a random bluff. There was a detective's name, badge number, and case file reference. He recognized the file number format instantly. He'd seen it before in court documents years ago. He put the paper down like it was burning his fingers. The following days were a haze. He couldn't focus. Every time he left his apartment, he felt eyes on him. Whenever his phone rang from an unknown number, his chest tightened. Once, walking down the street, he caught sight of a man leaning against a lamppost, staring too long. When he blinked, the man was gone, but the feeling lingered. Old instincts told him to skip town, change his name, vanish. But the problem was, Evelyn's words had been too precise. She didn't say, "If I find you," she said, "I already found you once." That meant she had traced him despite the fake IDs, the clean rental history, the prepaid burner phones. If she could do it once, she could do it again. He tried calling her. The number went straight to voicemail. He didn't dare leave a message. Then, one afternoon, an unmarked envelope appeared under his apartment door. Inside was a single photograph. Him, sitting at their cafe table 2 weeks ago, leaning across to charm her, completely unaware of the camera. On the back, in neat handwriting, was a single line. The words sat in his lap like a death sentence. 3 days for what? To turn himself in? To return the money he'd stolen? To disappear entirely? The uncertainty gnawed at him worse than any threat could. By the second night, paranoia had him pacing his apartment until dawn. He thought about all the aliases he'd used, the people he'd hurt, the little cruelties he'd justified in the name of survival. Now, the balance was coming due. On the morning of the third day, he found her waiting at the cafe. She was sitting in their usual corner, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. She looked up, smiled faintly, and gestured for him to sit. "You've had time to think," she said. He didn't bother pretending anymore. "What do you want from me?" "Closure," she said simply. "For my client. For the people you've left bleeding in your wake. You'll return every cent you've taken in the last 2 years. Then you'll walk into that detective's office and confess." He laughed once, a bitter, hopeless sound. "You think I'd just hand myself over?" Her smile didn't falter. She reached into her bag and placed a small flash drive on the table. "If you don't, this goes public. Names, dates, bank accounts. Every scheme you've run. Every victim you've conned. You're already on borrowed time. By now, the detective is watching your every move." And just like that, he realized she'd won before the game even started. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was giving him a way out, a threadbare lifeline. Whether he took it or not was almost irrelevant. Either way, his days of running the con were over. When he finally stood to leave, she didn't stop him. She just sipped her coffee and watched, as if she'd already written the ending to his story and was now merely waiting for it to play out. That was the last time he saw Evelyn Carr. But years later, sitting in a cramped prison library, he would still think about her. The woman who didn't just see through his lies, but used them to pull the rug out from under him. The one mark he never could beat. The one who chose him before he ever chose her. Prison changed him in ways he never imagined. At first, he clung to the habits that had kept him alive in the outside world, reading people's faces, spotting their tells, finding the weaknesses they didn't know they had. He tried to run the same small manipulations inside, trading favors, bending stories, but in prison, everyone was already on guard. Every man in there had been lied to or had lied themselves into a corner. They weren't impressed by charm. They were armed with suspicion. He learned to keep his head down, to listen more than he spoke. Nights were the worst, when the cell was quiet and the dark pressed in like a confession he didn't want to make. Evelyn's voice would drift back to him in those hours, calm, precise, unshakable. "You chose the wrong target." For months, he wondered why she hadn't just turned him over immediately. Why the 3 days? Why the strange mercy of letting him decide? It wasn't until his second year inside that it clicked. She hadn't wanted just to catch him. She wanted him to feel it. The weight of choice. The panic. The slow, creeping realization that someone else was pulling the strings. She wanted him to understand exactly what he'd done to others. One rainy afternoon, a guard slid an envelope under his cell door. It was from an unknown sender, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. Inside was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Written across the white border in neat, familiar ink were 4 words. His hands shook as he held it. The message wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was a reminder. Out there, beyond the fences and barbed wire, Evelyn Carr still had her eyes on him. She'd left no return address, no note, no explanation. Just a quiet signal that the game between them wasn't over. It had simply changed. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to win. He wanted to survive. He started writing letters, not to her, but to some of his victims. He didn't expect forgiveness. Most never replied. A few did, and their words cut deeper than any prison sentence. But in those rare replies, he felt something he hadn't before, something Evelyn had forced into his life. The truth, unvarnished and undeniable. Years later, when he was finally released, the world felt different. Smaller. Less eager to listen to him. He didn't go back to the old tricks. Not because he'd grown a conscience, but because he knew that somewhere out there, the Queen of Spades might appear again, slipped under a door, tucked into a wallet, waiting for the moment he forgot who was truly in control. Evelyn Carr had been his last mark. And the only one who had ever marked him back.